Steffe is a professional storyteller who shares her quick-witted, sensitive and stylish performances across the UK, especially in Liverpool, where she's established and runs the Juniper Tree, a student-led storytelling club in the heart of the city. Her academic research explores platforms for story-led performance, and particularly around female artists and creativity, including with Greek tragedy and classical receptions. And she researches and teaches at Liverpool Hope in the Department of Drama, Dance and Performance. And it's wonderful to find classics and classical topics being taught in such a range of diverse kind of departments and institutions. Today's event is specially recorded for us. I'm going to ask Steffe to introduce us very briefly to what we're going to see. She specially recorded her performance that she's created for us, a story based on Phrynichus's lost play, Alcestis. It's called Alcestis in Bits. So once we've had a brief introduction to what that is, I'll be playing, sharing my screen, and hopefully the video will play. And it would be wonderful if everyone could keep their microphones on mute while we do that, obviously. So do check you're muted. And that will last about 17, 18 minutes, I think. After which we'll come back onto our screen of faces, and we'll have opportunity for discussion with Steffe, and you can ask questions around her performance. And then we'll have some closing discussion. So Steffe, hello, thank you for joining us. I've had a sneak preview of this story, so I know it's fantastic. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us very briefly about the myth which is behind this play, this story, and what we're going to see.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this evening. I realise it's the 15th of December, and by rights, we should all be in pyjamas and face down in a box of chocolates by now. So I'm very impressed that you're all kind of here and upright and facing the camera. It's lovely to see you all. All right. So, yeah, Alcestis in Bits, as you just heard, is a let's call it a creative response to Phrynichus's lost tragedy, Alcestis. And I'm not going to try and tell you the plot of that for the very good reason that it is lost. And, I'm not going to start out by telling you lies, even if I finish up that way. But I can certainly give you the bare bones of the Alcestis myth, and particularly as it appears a bit later on in the work of Euripides. And I apologize to those of you who are more pure than me in your Greek. I realize some of you may well be yelling Alcestis in your head. I'm so sorry. I go with the anglicized version. Sorry about that. But I'm aware that I might be causing trauma for some of you, so feel free to twitch as we progress through the evening. So the myth centers around a husband and wife pair. And he is a king and she is a queen, and somewhere down the line, depending on which version of the myth you're into, but somewhere down the line, this king has done a favor for or has developed a friendship with the god Apollo. So Apollo decides that what he's going to do is give his friend a gift, the best possible gift, something really fantastic. And listen up, everyone, Christmas is coming. Write this down. The best gift that he can think of is the gift of not having to die at the moment when his death is meant to happen. So Apollo gives the king the gift of kind of immortality with some strings attached. Because the kind of hitch is the king doesn't have to die if he can find somebody else to die in his place, which is, a little bit of a sting in the tail. So again, depending on the version of the myth you favor, he asks, gloriously tactless, starts by asking his parents, his father, his mother, well, would you like to take my place and die? And they send him away with a flea in his ear. And gradually he works his way around the kingdom, sort of asking everyone he can think of, well, would you like to die in my place? Would that be an opportunity you'd be interested in? And of course, again and again, he's told, no, thank you, not today. So we finally find ourselves in a place where the day that the king has to die has come, and no one has volunteered to take his place. Apart, it turns out, from the one person he didn't ask, who is Alcestis or Alcestis, his wife, the queen. And she, in high classical style, offers to take her husband's place, to die his death instead of him. But she asks for something in return, because she's not daft. And she makes the king swear that if she dies in his place, that he will never remarry. He will never take another woman in her place, that particularly in Euripides, that he will never give her children a stepmother. So there are strings attached to this bit of the bargain as well. The deal is done. Alcestis dies. And there is great mourning and lamentation, because she was a loved queen and a loved human being. And at this point, certainly in Euripides, over the hill comes Heracles, looking for a party, looking for some food and some drink, and, you know, generally looking to have a good time. The king shows hospitality to Heracles. He really shouldn't, because the house is in mourning, because they're grieving a death. He really shouldn't let Heracles come into the house. He really shouldn't let him eat and drink and feast. But out of a sense of duty to a visitor, out of a sense of piety and friendship, he lets him come into the house. He shows him hospitality. He doesn't tell Heracles what has happened. He doesn't tell Heracles about the death of Alcestis. And the action of Euripides' tragedy kind of really gets going when Heracles finds out that he has been lied to. And Heracles, in fine Heracles style, decides that he is going to do something about it, that he, in effect, is going to do something about death. And I think that's probably enough for now. April, how was that?
Plenty. What an amazing kind of story. Yeah, I mean, it's everything you expect and more from a Greek tragedy, isn't it? So with all that in mind, I think we'll move to the performance. So I'm going to hope that my technical wizardry will work. And
well, while you are wizarding, shall I just give a little heads up to this very generous and patient audience, just so you're aware. Storytelling online is something that's still emerging. We're still kind of working out how to do it. But one of the things we have learned this year is that sometimes people feel that they have to watch the video. You know, we're showing you this on a computer screen, so you have to watch it. So I just want to say, if you feel like closing your eyes, if you feel like kind of slumping and going into a semi-dream state and imagining along with the story, then that's very welcome, and that's a very good way to listen to a story. So don't feel like we're going to test you on it afterwards. Okay, just, yeah, feel free to go with the flow.
Thank you, Steffi. That's really important to know. Thank you. I'm going to share the screen now, and hope that, because we're doing this on a YouTube link, that there are no adverts that come in at the time.
It wasn't meant to be this way, was it? I wanted to be in a room with you. I wanted to see your faces. Wanted to feel the energy of the story dancing in the particles between us. Of course, as it goes, what would have been dancing in the particles between us was death. So it's probably better this way. And in any case, what I have to tell you isn't really a story. It's a handful of broken bits and pieces, a few fragments, not much. But then, in this year of shattered plans and broken promises, maybe not much is just enough. The god walked into the darkness, The dim places below the earth, lit only with the golden glow of his divine flesh. Deeper and deeper into the dark he went until he found what he was looking for. 3 figures, hunched over and still as stones. Only their fingers moved. 1 pair of hands spinning, 1 measuring, and 1 snip, snip, snipping. The god had a strategy. The god was prepared. He poured out 3 brimming cups of wine there in the darkness. And in the darkness, he poured out another gift too, music. And as he played, he felt rather than saw a foot begin to tap, a cheek begin to flush, a pair of lips begin to move in the words of an old song. And the god smiled. His plan was working. When the music was finished, he leaned down and he asked for a gift. And he got it. And he walked back to the world of the living, to the gold of the sun, the blue of the sky, with joy in his heart, because he had a gift, not for himself, but for his friend, the friend who had been there on the day that the world shattered into pieces. A gift from a god. Well, what could possibly go wrong? Do you remember? The morning you walked away and she screamed after you so all the neighbors, all the street could hear. Do you remember? Him holding you so hard that you thought your bones would break, your flesh be bruised, all the breath be squeezed out of your body. You remember? The queen was dying. She stepped out of the palace to say her last farewells to the golden sun and the blue of the sky. Already her legs were growing weak beneath her, and her husband, the king, put an arm around her waist to help support her. But things were getting strange now. Her eyes were starting to flicker, sometimes seeing the gold and the blue, but at other moments seeming to fix on a different world beyond, where a grey river moved slow and silent, where a wordless figure stood, holding a sword. Her husband wrapped his arms more tightly around her, as if he could loan her his health, his strength, but she fought him now, trying to rip his fingers out of hers, trying to tear his hands from her clothes, thrashing with all her weight against his breastbone, like a bird that finds itself trapped behind a window pane. And then the wordless figure leaned down and lifted a lock of hair and cut. And then it was finished. Alcestis was dead. Sometimes I think it's like that moment when your fingers are slippy or soapy or just clumsy and a plate slips and smashes on the kitchen floor. Not the moment when it falls and not the moment when it crashes, not the smash and the noise, not that, but what comes after. That moment when you stand blinking and astonished, staring at a world that is suddenly all sharp point and jagged edge, where you don't dare to take a step in any direction. It's like that, I think, sometimes. Like that. The king hadn't known that it would be this way. No one had told him, no one had dared, and now it was too late. Grief coursed through him like a tidal wave, a pain so deep, so intense, he thought it might break the bone cage of his body into pieces, ripping him into bloody fragments. He didn't know what to do. He issued commands, he gave orders. He ordered that all the shops in the high street be shuttered, that the children in the infant school stop singing their songs. He ordered the whole kingdom into solitude and silence. He ordered that the household slaves should shear their heads, that the horses in the stables should lose their manes. And when he had run out of words and when he had run out of breath, he recoiled from the sunlight, hid himself in the quiet, private places of the palace. He stared into the depths of his shaving mirror, and a stranger stared back at him. He reached with trembling hands for his razor, began to scrape and shave and cut and hack at his own head until he stood bald and bloody and vulnerable as an infant born a heartbeat ago. And if time passed, he didn't notice. In bits, we say, at times like that. In bits. 2 simple little words. For when life has winded all the eloquence out of us and left us only the monosyllables. The Urban Dictionary gives a very rude first definition, which I'm not going to repeat to you here and now, but it also says exhausted, knackered, broken, ugly. And we are all those things when we're in bits. It's what we say when we mean the world has slipped from my fingers and smashed into pieces. In bits. I'm in bits. There came a knock at the door. The king didn't hear, the king didn't lift up his head, but still, above his mirror, for a moment, a light flickered. Slaves ran to the door with rebukes rising to their lips, ready to shoo away the fool who had dared to knock on the door of the house of grief. But when they opened the door, those words died in silence, because what stood there was 7 foot of flesh and bone and muscle and sinew and stench and fury, all wrapped in the uncured pelt of a mountain lion that the wearer had murdered himself with his beast-slaying, man-slaying hands. If you look closely, there was still a little bit of blood drying under one fingernail. Heracles. Now, when Heracles knocks at the door, it is often a good idea to seek advice from someone higher up your organization. And this is what was done. The king raised his head for a moment and gave orders. The demigod was brought into the house, shown to his own rooms, given food, given drink, treated with hospitality, an early form of social distancing, if you like. But he was not given the truth. No one told him what had happened. I went through a phase when I was younger, a long time ago now. I went through a phase of ripping teapots apart with my bare hands. And I know that sounds ridiculous, and it sounds ridiculous to me, and I'm the one it happened to, but still, I don't know what grief or rage or energy or power was passing through my teenage fingers. But again and again, I would pick up the teapot, carry it to the sink to empty it, to rinse it, and I would look down and there would be a broken handle, a ripped off spout, a twisted mess of broken crocks in my hands. Again and again, the teapot with the spots, the teapot with the flowers. I mean, it doesn't happen anymore, which is probably a good thing. Well, it mostly doesn't happen anymore. There was one incident last year with ripping the knob up, but you don't need to know about that. It mostly doesn't happen anymore. And mostly I don't think about it. Except sometimes I remember and I wonder. Alone, Heracles feasted, filling his gigantic appetite with bread and meat and wine, and more bread and meat and wine, and yet more bread and meat and wine, keeping a whole line of slaves, pale-faced and red-eyed, running backwards and forwards all night long, keeping the kitchen fires burning so late that their pale smoke mingled with the dirty grey of dawn. Bread and meat and wine, and more bread and meat and wine, and yet more bread and meat and wine, and gradually that wine and more wine began to take its toll, and Heracles began to sing. Well, not just singing, he climbed up on the table and thumping his meaty foot to give himself a beat, he began to sing the songs of his own heroic deeds, spraying spittle and pie crust across the room, singing loudly and badly enough to wake the dead. If the dead could be wakened that way. The slaves watched and listened, appalled, exhausted, not knowing what to do. At last, one of them, a man carrying a wine jug worth more than his life, at last he lifted up his head as if he would have spoken. But at that moment, his finger met with a splash of wine or a smear of grease, and the jug slipped out of his fingers and fell. It smashed into 100 pieces, carpeting the room in jagged fragments and splashing wine off the wall like dripping blood. And then there was silence. And everyone was still. And in that stillness and that silence, the man found the words he wanted to speak. Alcestis is dead. Do you remember the phone ringing in the middle of the night, that flashing screen, that piercing beep, and rolling out of bed, grabbing the first clothes you could find, stamping your feet into the first pair of shoes you tripped over, and then out into the night, praying wordlessly to any god who might be moving beside you in the darkness? Do you remember? The god went into the dark, the dim places below the earth, lit only with the golden glow of his own demi-godly flesh, deeper and deeper into the dark. But this was Heracles, so there was no strategy, there was no plan, there was no wine to pour out in offering to the fates, only the stink of his breath. There was no music, only his own flesh and blood and bone and sinew and the grief that coursed through his too mortal heart. And any plan he might have had was craziness, madness. You cannot march into the underworld and demand to wrestle death. That's not how it works. You cannot fight an intangibility. You cannot wrap your arms around his, thrust your weight against his breastbone. That's not how it works. Except sometimes we desperately, urgently, hopelessly wish that it was. A little while later, a woman stood blinking in the unexpected gold and blue light of the sky of the living world. A light breeze lifting the hem of her grave clothes, and the dust of the tomb still heavy on her tongue, so that although her lips moved, there was no sound. Standing next to her, Heracles felt the sweat on his body grow chill. He shivered. He turned and walked away. You remember telling yourself that you would make it right tomorrow. You would pick up the phone, send an email, write that letter tomorrow or the next day. By the weekend, definitely then, or by the end of the month, before the holidays, by Christmas. There was plenty of time, always plenty of time. Until suddenly, there wasn't. Behind the palace, in a quiet place where no one ever went, a man sat on the ground. and laid out in front of him were the carefully collected pieces of what had once been an elegant wine jug. One by one, he picked up the pieces, held them to the light, turning them, trying to picture how they could fit together. And then gently, with patience, and with a little pot of paste made from flour and water, he began slowly, slowly to fit the pieces together. And when he'd finished his labor, what he held in his careful hands, well, it wasn't an elegant wine jug. It would never be that again, but it was something, a vessel. We might call it a bowl, good enough to hold water, to lift the parched lips in kindness, good enough to fill with oil or honey or wine, to pour out an offering, to accompany a prayer, to give a blessing. Not much. Maybe enough. Do you remember that feeling? Suddenly, shockingly aware that you were utterly broken and in the same heartbeat, utterly, miraculously whole. Do you remember? Do you?